talking about market structure. Again, market is the place where buyers and sellers voluntarily interact, a voluntary exchange. Market structure is talking about categories for the amount of competition that businesses face, and there's kind of a spectrum. There's a lot of different types of markets that can exist from country to country, from location to location. And on one side of it, all the way to the left of the graphic at the bottom, you have when you have the maximum amount of competition. And then all the way to the right is when you have the least amount of competition, and all the power over the market is concentrated in a really small set of hands, or maybe just one set of hands, one company. And there's four general categories. There's perfect competition. That's at the far spectrum. When no one has any control over the market, no one person, it's controlled by just demand and supply entirely, and not by greed, or one person's greed, or sneaky tactics, or cheating, or lying. It's all supply and demand. Then you got monopolistic competition, a little less competition, but still a lot. Oligopoly or oligopoly is when you have multiple people who control all the businesses, but not many. Just like maybe there's only 3 or 4 controlling everything. And a monopoly is one person or one business controls the whole market share. Like all the products are only made by that one person, can't buy from anywhere else. So let's get into that a little bit. Perfect competition. When you have absolute perfect competition, it's when a market includes so many sellers of a particular good or service that each seller accounts for only a small part of the total market. An example of not perfect competition would be smartphones. Right now, probably about 80% of the market share is controlled by Google, Android, and Apple. Microsoft has got a little piece, and there's other companies that have got a little piece, but it's pretty much dominated by those two. That's not perfect competition. You'd have to have multiple different types of Apple and Android, all owned by different people, that have perfect competition, and that's what's considered a large market. There's a lot of choices, and independence. That is another marker of perfect competition. Everyone's kind of independent of each other. No one's dependent on what everybody else does. You're just looking at what do people want, and you're offering it to them as a buyer. And sellers will have many choices from that, and what their decision making isn't really dependent on what anybody else is doing. Easy entry and exit. It's usually really easy to get into the market, and it's really easy to get out of the market as a buyer or a seller. Easily obtainable information, meaning that you can easily find out about any company at all that you're buying from in perfect competition. There's no secrets, there's no hidden messages. It's just all the information you could possibly want to know about a product and its seller is available. And finally, all products are nearly identical. You don't have a huge jump in quality from one product to the next. Everything is pretty much the same quality, and you're kind of just picking things based on maybe personal preference and demand, but not because one thing really is better than another. You just, well, I like pink, so I'm buying pink. Pink's not necessarily better than another color or worse. It's just, I like pink, or I like purple, or I like brown. But whatever you're buying, it's pink, purple, or brown, whether it's bananas or apples or iPods, they're all going to be same quality, almost the same product. Now there are small micro examples. You won't see a whole country in this perfect world, but sometimes you'll see small markets that are pretty close. Agriculture is one of those. It's a rare example of a perfectly competitive industry in which farmers have little control over the market price of their goods. People are going to pay what they're going to pay for wheat, and there's no name brand wheat or generic name brand wheat. I mean, wheat is wheat. Wherever you buy it, it's just the same. No matter who grows it, it's wheat. So market price is entirely determined by supply and demand. What people actually are eating in wheat, products made from wheat, and what's actually available, which also farmers have very little control over because they can't control things like weather and droughts and stuff like that, or bug invasions. They can try to fight some of these things to a certain extent, but they can't stop them from happening in the first place. So market price is determined entirely not by any seller. Because again, in a perfect competition, no one seller has any control over market price. Whereas a monopoly, only one seller has control over market price. And on that spectrum from the first slide, there's all kinds of thing arranged in between one and nobody. So again, perfect competition, no one seller has any power over market price. Pure monopoly has 4 characteristics. You will need to know these. The first I mentioned earlier when I talked about a single seller. There's only one person who controls it all. He gets all the profits. He dominates everything. No one else offers that service. And not only does that person completely control the good or service, but there's no one else that sells anything like it. That's why a monopoly over oil is so dangerous if someone were to have that, and it's happened in the past, because they could completely control price, charge as much as they want, because what else are you going to put in your car? That's right, nothing. You going to put corn in it? No, not yet. Just oil. We ain't got much else to work on. We're trying, but we're not there yet. So that just cannot have a monopoly there. Would just be absolutely devastating to oil prices for us, because that company could charge what they felt like. Barriers to entry. It is very difficult, almost impossible, to get in and start to compete with the monopoly unless the government gets involved and forces them to break up into smaller pieces or give up some of their power or allow competitors, because they have no interest in competition. Competition means they might have to lower their prices to make sure that people buy what they're trying to sell. They don't want to do that. So they're going to try very hard to make sure they're going to keep these barriers to entry so no one else can enter the market and compete with them. And finally, almost complete control of market price. De Beers, they sell diamonds, and they've completely inflated the price over diamonds over the past few decades. Diamonds are not the most precious, hard to find, rare diamond or gem there is out there. There are much more valuable or hard to find gems out there besides diamonds, but it's easier to get those because one company doesn't control almost the entire supply. So what De Beers does is they only sell just enough diamonds to make them more rare than they actually are, because you can't just go to a diamond mine and get one yourself. You can only get what's sold to you. But if so few are being sold and offered to you, then the sellers will jack up the prices because so many people want diamonds for so many different reasons. So that jacks up the price on everybody because they have almost complete domination over the market, which gives them complete control over market price. Oligopoly. This is an industry dominated by several suppliers who exercise some control over price. Now, monopolies are illegal. Oligopolies are not. They're very similar, and you'll notice some of the differences or similarities, but also some differences. One is oligopolies compete without using price. So Coke and Pepsi have a sort of oligopoly over soda. They own a lot of soda brands, and they compete usually not through price. Usually, sometimes there's sales and deals, but almost always Coke and Pepsi cost the same. So how do they compete? Advertising, new flavors, trying to say that theirs is better, tastes better, a lot of different things, but they won't compete over price because they've agreed to keep it at a certain price so that they don't have to lose money over a price fight. Like, oh, I'm going to charge a little bit less to try to outsell the other guy, and then the other guy has to go down lower, but then they both lose profits. So they keep things at the same price. Interdependence. They kind of depend on having control being in the hands of just a few companies. So they're dependent on each other to both continue to compete. They want to be number one over the other guy, but they don't want the other guy to disappear. Because then it's kind of like the whole like the devil you know kind of thing. We don't like the competitor, but as long as we're the only competitors, we know exactly what our profits are going to be, give or take. We know we won't fail. They won't fail either. We'll just try to be number one, but we want to make sure they're still number two, even if we are. Barriers to entry, it's going to be almost impossible to break into the Coke market. If you want to start selling colas, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, competitor to that, it's going to be almost impossible to have a new brand not owned by Coke or Pepsi that's going to still be successful, at least at their level. Because it's dominated by a few sellers. That's a characteristic of an oligopoly. Domination by just a few sellers. Microsoft is no longer a monopoly, but still there's not that many choices. You got Linux, which almost doesn't count because hardly anybody uses it. Then there's Apple, and then there's Microsoft and Android. A nearly identical or slightly similar product is the final characteristic. So Coke and Pepsi, they're not the exact same product, and I'm sure some of you are going to be like, oh no, one's horrible. But really, if you look at the ingredients list, they're almost the same. There are differences, but they're almost the same. You're going to see that in oligopolies, and you're going to see that more and more with Apple, Android, and Microsoft as you start to see them taking ideas from each other, which is not stealing, just taking, and they're going to start feeling more and more similar. There's going to be differences, but they're all effectively going to be doing the same thing.